Um, we have hipster and hippie and hip. The word hip is derived from um, an African word, happy or hippie, to see or to open one's eye, which came to America from West African slaves. But let me decline this. What I'm interested in is this idea that often we think of modernity as a sort of fairly straight line, and that it's between Europe and America, there's an unbroken continuity of a kind of memory system, if you like, that everyone shares the same modernist values, and that there's a sort of linearity to it. And particularly in Americans' context, I think there's two or three memory systems coinciding, notably the memory system which comes all the way from Africa with slavery, and makes manifest in terms of almost a counterculture, an underground culture, or a culture which is not modernist in its sort of origin, in its memory system. Then we've got another memory system which is from Europe, and mainly made up of immigration of Jewish people. And you could say that there's American culture hides two main traumas, that of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and that of the slave trade. And so there's a kind of repressive relationship to those memory systems, or an outsider relationship. It's not seen as mainstream modernity, and modernity is based upon certainly on the import into America of modernity is on the code of purification and sublimation, and in corresponding terms, the concert hall and the gallery and fine institutions, whereas hip is largely identified with the street. So I think we need to be cognizant now of the memory systems of modernity are breaking up. For instance, the Chinese memory system is different from the European. It's got a broken relationship to modernity, an unfinished relationship to modernity, but it's got different memory systems related to the classical tradition, or to the social realist tradition, which is imported through the Soviet Union, which was imported through French history painting and academic realism. So we're becoming much more aware as the memory systems break up of a discontinuous relationship to history. And I think we need to take more seriously the culture of, well, the counterculture of modernity, the other side of modernity. As if to see is also to see in a certain way. One of the things which hip does is it's a curvature of becoming. It's not a straight line. Anyway, let's see the. So the story of hip is a history of outsiders dealing with the sense of the mainstream inside of the culture, which is the story of Afro-Americans and European Americans having to forge new identities, and such is the story of mass invention and creative interplay. The poetic and the political, the gesture and language, the street and performance all converge and commingle in hip. Whereas modernism secures its gestures in the museum and concert hall, hip skips around more lowly quarters in order to evade either sublimation or purification. So that's my main thesis. But if we look at counterculture, what is the significant forms? And there's a kind of lyric which runs through counterculture, a kind of a lyricism which is very particularly American, and a kind of mutation occurs between, let's say, later on in the post-war years, between beat culture and Afro-American culture. So with blues, it starts in the fields in the South, the Mississippi Delta blues. We have figures like, I'll play some music later, people like Son House or and there's clearly a demarcation through the political repressive regime, which was the foundation of American culture. So blues music is located somewhere in between the memory of Africa and the immediacy of oppression in the Delta fields, and between the rural South and the urban North. It's Howlin' Wolf. John Lee Hooker. So a lot of the blues now is identified with the North, Philadelphia and Chicago, the great urban centers, the centers of car production usually. It's Billie Holiday. I'll go through the slides quite quickly just to so we had again, as a counter modernity, there was a renaissance in Harlem that spanned the 20s and signified intellectual, fashion, dance, and music forms, which gained in creative direction. It was a kind of discrete cultural world, and often people from uptown went to Harlem to revel in this new fusion culture of jazz and gestural dance and fashion and even transgression. This is a Cotton Club. Many of these, there's a film of the same making. So the US came out of World War II as the most powerful nation state, both technologically and economically. Europe was largely devastated and had to rebuild its entire infrastructure, as the same with Japan. So America clearly came out as in opposition to the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, the Iron Curtain, but as a champion of the free world and the free market. And also inaugurated McCarthyism. Our job as Americans and as Republicans is to dislodge the traitors in every place where they've been sent to do their traitorous work. So it's a kind of period of incredible repression. And so you have the technological supremacy, but you also have this repressive political order, which is based partly on the memory system of Puritanism, and Puritanism becoming a form of republicanism. And this idea that there is repressiveness politically with this idea of the dream, the American dream, and the image of a kind of suburban America with the false lawns and suburban housing and soft music and so we have the Cold War and hot jazz, the comfort of suburbia, the speed of rock and roll, the anxiety of death, the sex appeal of the automobile, color TV, and persuasion. It's an image of Lone Ranger. again with its Tonto doesn't speak. Lone Ranger is the masked man, but he speaks. Lone Ranger has the white horse. So in the 50s, that was the main TV portrayals of the pre-industrial West. But America was fast; it was on the move. It had a rhythm, it had a speed that no other culture had. It had color TV. This is Charlie Parker, who was the greatest bebop musician. So it emphasized speed and fast music and improvisation and a sort of a lyric which was faster than the culture, almost more intense than the culture. And Little Richard inaugurated, in a way, rock and roll. He brought in a new dynamic and a new sort of performative principle. But again, this incredible, moving faster than almost the camera could catch. Again, a gestural theatre with a tutti frutti, this kind of lyric of patois, a kind of taking blues and sexual innuendos into the mainstream and getting America excited and moving and inflaming the youth of America. So it's kind of, he started off as in the church and went over to what was called devil's music. And one of the interesting features of blues is the relationship to Jewish ownership of record labels. So Chess Records recorded many of the blues artists who had made Chicago their home. Chess emblemized the relationship between Jewish producers and Black recording artists. When Elvis made his first recordings, listeners thought he must be Black. He was called Elvis the Pelvis. Again, this sort of new rhythm, this new speed, this new, from the hip, as it were. It's not just hipster culture. It's almost the movement of the hips was emblematic of this straight and stiff and grey culture with a dynamic youth culture, a kind of hysteria, if you like, a kind of intensification of sound and rhythm and gesture. This is Sister Rosetta Sharp, who was one of the first performing with guitar, first women to perform with guitar, Steaming in a Dreaming. This is Marlon Brando in The Wild One from '53, and this language of square, being square and being hip, wasn't just a hippie thing, it was also to do with bikers and 50s rock and roll culture. This idea of the culture dividing between straight and hip started very much in the 50s. This is Marlon Brando in Streetcar of Desire, 51. This brooding, this new way of acting, method acting, which gets inside the emotion and is very intense, but it's not verbal. It's all full of signifiers of the look and the lisp and the gestural economy of movement, kind of way of acting out emotion, raw emotion. It's James Dean, another method actor, Rebel Without a Cause. And this idea of living young and not being too concerned about dying young. And this kind of inauguration of a style, a kind of, again, something contrary to the corporate look. That's him in his Porsche, which... So James Dean signified a life lived against the grain, a fast life, but with a nonchalant style. He died when he crashed his Porsche. So again, this obsession with speed and intensity and style, also being on the edge of a kind of death all the time, a danger, a kind of dangerous culture. So in the 50s, we get the beginnings of beat culture. Jack Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs each met at Columbia University after rolling in 44. Each in their different ways were responding to the Second World War, and following this, the Cold War, which in the words of Ginsberg was the imposition of a vast mental barrier on everybody, a vast anti-natural psyche, a hardening, a shutting off of the perception of desire and tenderness. Beat was commitment to what was in the margins of both the city, but also language. So a kind of new relationship to language, a sensual relationship to words, something which emphasized the age signifier, the lyric of words, embedded in words, and in opposition to straight language or to authoritarian structures which were embodied by the majority in the political establishment. This is Ginsberg and Kerouac. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix, angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of the night. This is a section from Howl. He was put on trial for obscenity, one of the great products of American culture now. Started its life as in the courtroom. He said, this is Jack Kerouac, the only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles, exploding like spiders across the stars. And in the middle of, you see the blue center light pop and everyone goes, ah, on the road. On the road was written in a continuous scroll of paper. He wrote it on coffee and speed. So he was speeded up the rhythm of language. So language, hip is a private use of language and gestures that are originally to be discovered in the street. It floats what is proper and instead discovers itself within the transgressive margins. It picks up on things foreign or other in order to bend the rule. So this kind of curvature, this feeling of seeing round corners and looking into things which are formerly overlooked, or it's a kind of swagger as well to it, kind of so it kind of literally relates to the hip movement as well as the bending of language and gesture. This is William Burroughs. In the US, you have to be a deviant or die of boredom. So again, this demarcation of two cultures. Cold War hit, one source of newness caught up the first updraft of mass culture. It was both magnified and diminished in the process. The Naked Lunch, by William Burroughs. This is Gregory Corso, poet. Standing on the street corner, waiting for no one is power. So a redefinition of politics, a kind of beginnings of not just a counterculture, but an alternative way of understanding politics, the politics of the street, the politics which derives from being nowhere, but being everywhere as well. The great Lenny Bruce, Miami Bridge is where neon goes to die. This kind of fast phrases and sharp wit, and again, he was always in trouble with the law. So to be counterculture is to be on the edge of this, not just on the street, but the edge of the legal apparatus. The book called White Negro by Norman Mailer. The hipsters absorbed this existential synapses of the Negro, and his practical purpose could be considered a white Negro. So a kind of corresponding culture between the hipsters and the old hip embodied in blues and jazz. Norman Mailer, the book Hipsters. One is hip or one is square, one is a rebel or one conforms. It's Norman Mailer. His early novels. It's really interesting that Mailer and other writers of the 50s were seen as the first form of postmodernists. Postmodernism was first used in relationship to American literature. It was a sort of mixture of genre, if you like, a mixture of language. So street and more literary sources are mixed together, kind of patois with straight language, academic language. Yeah, fighting a war to fix something works about as good as going to the warhouse to get rid of the clap. This is Norman Mailer in The Naked and the Dead. And you also have the, not just the hipster, but the trickster. So no, just as Marlon Brando seemed to inhabit a role as though it were a natural extension of mood, so Ali is treated boxing. He famously wrote on Ali. And his immortal phrase, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. So again, he took over the airways. He not just boxed, but he also went against the grain of American culture. He used to sort of compose lines, poetic lines, and would box with words on TV. So before any fight, he had a kind of a phrase or a short poem, and he refused to go to Vietnam, so he's stripped of his world title. No, I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to murder and burn another poor nation simply to continue the domination of the white slave masters of the darker people the world over. This is the day when such evils must come to the end. I've been warned that to take a stand would cost me millions of dollars, but I've said it once and I'll say it again. The real enemy of my people is here. I will not disgrace my religion, my people, myself by becoming a tool to enslave those who are fighting for their own justice, freedom, and equality. I thought the war was going to bring freedom and equality to 22 million of my own people. They wouldn't have to draft me. I'd join tomorrow. I have nothing to lose by standing up for my beliefs. So I'll go to jail. So what? I've been in jail for 400 years. Joseph Heller catch-22. Catch-22 is if you go to war, you're mad, and if you want to get out of the war for madness, you qualify for going to war. So again, this idea of the whole society being run by catch-22 phrases and catchisms. The term postmodernism was first employed in the United States in the 50s in relation to a new wave of novelists who spliced together elements of high and low culture. The term post-industrial society was also introduced in the 50s by Daniel Bell. And the other way of understanding this shift was to realize the dynamics of the margin and the center was shifting. Mainstream writing had absorbed hip values. Probably the greatest artists of the American 20th century, Miles Davis, who introduced the birth of the cool and went on to innovate continually. Had about 5 or 6 main different innovations within jazz culture. He was once, towards the end of his life, he was invited to the White House for one of these lunches, and he sat next to this lady who lunched in part of the establishment, and she said to him, she didn't recognize who he was, and she said to him, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well, I've changed the course of jazz 5 or 6 times." But he said to her, what have you done besides being white? Which is a bit sharp-tongued and cruel, but he would make his point in that kind of very fast, hip kind of way of not being put down. When he went to Paris in the late 50s, and he said it's the first time he felt like he was treated like a human being. He became a celebrity on the left bank milieu, in the left bank milieu, and it's one of his great albums, Sketches of Spain, which is a hybrid of Spanish classical music, namely Rodrigo, and flamenco and jazz. It was in 59. So he's the first to do real crossover. It's really a fantastic, I mean, it's still selling today in vast quantities. It's seen as a great classic. It's in Silent Way, where he introduced the idea of electro jazz from the 69, played with musicians like I forget all the names of, but he kept assembling new bands and introducing new players into music. He'd always say that he didn't pay his musicians just to go through the paces. He said, "I'd pay you to experiment." He wanted them to play music like never been played before. It's really interesting. I was reading a book about this someone who was trying to learn the blues and couldn't work out how he'd see a chord played and wondered why it didn't sound the same. And So there was the great blues musicians always bend music, always bend the chord. So you never kind of quite know what you're listening to. You don't know where it comes from. It's a little bit the same with Miles Davis. The sound which came out was always not straight. It was had a curvature to it, or a curve to it. It's Jack Johnson by Miles Davis. Certain point he took up boxing. He with him in his funk period. He'd often play with his back to the audience, and he said they don't come and see me to look at me; they come to listen to me. And but there was an intelligence to this. He moved around the stage, and he found those parts of the space where the sound was better, the acoustics were better. So he sought out the acoustic, the right place to be, and very often he finished up with his back to the audience. Get the right sound. It wasn't just being awkward. He was actually so sensitive about sound that he would find a place to play. The record Take 5 was released. It was immediate top seller because it was both cool in its idiom but alongside the roots of jazz, it had a classical structure. So it was close to the pulse of modernity in the concert hall. So very often jazz divided between that was acceptable to the concert hall and the TV. It was one of the most successful jazz records in history. This is "The Love Supreme" by John Coltrane. John Coltrane had played with Miles Davis, and Miles Davis got fed up with him being on heroin and threw him out of the band or asked him to leave the band. Damn rules, it's the feeling that counts. It's John Coltrane. This is his wife, Alice Coltrane, who played both the piano and the harp. I'll play some music from her LP with Pharoah Sanders after the lecture. Mort Rothko was a European immigrant who embodied a high modernist disposition. He was part of a generation that wished to lose the object of attention within the subjective field of becoming. His sense of tragedy reached back to the Greeks while retaining the memory of the camps. Properly speaking, his art enacted sublimation and in turn purification, while the stains of color were tinged with traces of melancholia. This is in contrast with blues, which was the art of mourning, whose energetic disposition was constant returning to the lost object of attention, and in that vocalized repression directly. So there's a kind of culture clash to do with different forms of memory, particularly in the period of the 1950s, with abstract expressionism, jazz and blues, and beat poetry. One who's happy being a cosmopolitan shelters a shattered origin in the night of his wandering. That could be directly evoking the relationship of Jewish immigrants like Rothko. So I'd say American modernity is in part based on the repression of memory, and as such becomes a culture of forgetting. This is why it aspires to values born out of sublimation and purification. The blues, as an Afro-American idiom, was never included in the modernist desiring economy because it needed to retain its memory of trauma in the face of its repetition within everyday life. Blues is a culture of the outside, just as Jewish intellectual life retains the memory of events, which makes it make affirmative cultural gestures impossible. American modernity is secured in part by understanding that the museum was a place to store memory of other cultures, and this secured enlightenment. It was an attitude that circulated around the suspicion that it was linked to barbarism, thus sidestepping the appeal and the tendency towards, I've got blocked foundation to the principles of high culture. To be hip is not to agree with such principles. So besides hipster and culture, we get the trickster figure. And one of the great tricksters who came to America was Duchamp. He's part avant-garde outsider, part dandy, and part trickster who set up false trails and dead ends. Things with Duchamp were never as they appeared on the surface because he balanced being exterior to the mainstream with the quest of being ahead of the game. In his work, became a magnet for those artists who wished to work against the grain. Also, Duchamp playing chess. So he said he'd given up making art for chess, which is again is this trickster relationship to the aesthetic apparatus. And John Cage took what was positioned on the outside, such as Zen, Dada, I Ching, chant, silence, and sound, in order to foster a new decentered aesthetic based on the logic of surprise. So famously, he did the concert hall performance where he picked up he just sat in silence in front of he lifted the lid of the piano and closed it at a certain length of time. I forget how long it was 4 minutes 33 or something like that. He just got the concert hall people to listen to the sound of the ambient sound, as it were. But in a way, he was kind of both partly a Zenist, partly a trickster, partly a serious avant-gardist. So we get this mutation of attitude and memory systems. Another famous counterculture figure is Jonas Mekas, who was part of the Fluxus movement, who was responsible for establishing the independent cinema in New York. So again, the underground cinema or underground film, as it was called in time, was much more part of a countercultural movement than it was of the mainstream aesthetic movement. Now it's incorporated into the museum culture, but in the 60s, characters like Jonas Mekas and John Cage were seen as much as outsider, avant-gardist, counterculture, kind of fusion of the three cultures, but again, bringing different memory into America, Eastern European memory. We get the greatest burst of speech writing and novels and public speaking and a whole raft of Black intellectuals. A speech by James Baldwin to play later. His book, The Fire Next Time. Angela Davis, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, all articulated the plight of the civil rights movement in the 60s. A new fusion between politics and poetics, a kind of way of speaking with metaphor and poetic grace and inflection and gestural economy. This is a photograph of Huey P. Newton, who was head of the Black Panther Party, formed the Black Panther Party with Bobby Seale in '66. It became an emblematic photograph, the relationship between the gun and the spear. He learned his politics in prison. He was a kind of learned quite a lot from the writings of Mao. Ideas to do with guerrilla warfare and how to defeat an enemy which is armed far more stringently. There's Dick Gregory. We used to root for the Indians against the cavalry because we didn't think it was fair. I can't read this. Is there anything I can switch off this translation? To Nina Simone. She was refused a place. She was a great piano player, but she was refused to. She wanted to play Bach, wanted to play classical music, but she was refused entry into the finest academy of American music. Ironically, she was later given a special, I think, professorship of that academy. Jazz is not just music, it's a way of life, it's a way of being, a way of thinking. So another way of talking, not just a modernist idea of art and life, but another kind of more grounded relationship between art and life. James Brown. If there was street disturbance, they often put James Brown on TV to get everyone to go inside to listen to him. He was one of the first to do the moonwalk. Wasn't Michael Jackson? Hip is the fascination with the outside. It moves against the grain of the center, which attempts to procreate it as sense. Hip resists this by being on the move and obscuring its position. Bob Dylan. Our play partner, as you walk in a room with a pencil in your hand, you see someone naked and you say, "Who is that man?" You try so hard, but you don't understand just what you'll say when you get home because something is happening here and you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? You raise up your hand and you ask, "Is this where it is?" And someone points to you and says, "It is, it is." And you say, "What's mine?" And someone else says, "Well, what is?" And you say, "Oh my God, am I here all alone?" A kind of relationship to fragmentary modernist poetry, but a kind of also a hip existential rhythm to it. This is from the mid 60s, 60, 66, 67, Ballad of the Thin Man. Again, this use of the sharp one-liner. Some people feel the rain, others just get wet. This differentiation between straight and hip is always on the edge of a phrase. You say, "What's mine?" and you say, "What is?" And you say, "Oh my God, you're all alone." This is Dylan before his screen test with Andy Warhol. So Warhol was mainly identified with counterculture in the 60s. He gave Dylan this double Elvis or single Elvis. And you get figures like Susan Sontag, the great essay writer, who's wrote against interpretation, but she again mixed the kind of sense of the hip with the academic. She appealed in the essay against interpretation that she said we don't need the hermeneutics of art, the hermeneutics being sort of phrase from Heideggerian existentialism. We need the erotics of art, kind of a Nietzschean posture. But it's again this way of coming up with a phrase from the hip, as it were, that characterized a lot of her writing, like on Camp, and so the serious import of American avant-garde, European avant-garde values with kind of American streetwise lilt to the writing. And again, the only interesting answers are those which destroy the questions. Something you don't learn in academia. So she took, again, European avant-garde ideas of writing and gave them a kind of currency within mass culture. A counterculture. So Herbert Marcuse, who's again went from European Frankfurt School to California and taught Angela Davis. People who recognize themselves in their commodities, they find their soul in the automobile, hi-fi set, split level home. Hippie's rebellion and seeks autonomy. Hip waits around in the shadows of the mainstream. Hip transforms language as it is given. It is as such unpure. Hip is the opposition to what is straight. It is the employment of the curve. There's Andy Warhol and Velvet Underground. So he managed or promoted the Velvet Underground, which were in opposition in a way to the aesthetics of the Californian hippie movement. Heavy drugs and SM and sunglasses inside. It's a Nico of the underground. It's Lou Reed, lead singer of Velvet Underground. You've got to blow the roof off your heart and let the universe in. Or alternatively, I want to be black. So the West Coast was particularly emblemized by groups like the Jefferson Airplane. Lead singers Grace Slick. It's a kind of new psychedelic culture. So coming out of beat into a kind of more away from caffeine and speed into psychedelics and weed. And the underground cinema mutated into Hollywood, and this is Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper in The Easy Rider. A couple of hipsters going across America with some to push some drugs, and so it was a sort of soundtrack of American hard rock music, and it's sort of almost this coming out of On the Road. It made a fortune for the it was very low budget, but it became a mainstream film. This is Ken Kesey and the American Pranksters, who before LSD became illegal, they took LSD around America. Kesey wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was made into a film. And then you get this hybrid culture begin to emerge between the psychedelic culture and blues. So Jimi Hendrix produced this hybrid of blues and psychedelic rock. He kind of probably developed the phrase kind of acid rock, or kind of had this relationship to the stars and to the to a kind of sense of being a space cadet, is another phrase of this period. Then in the urban, in New York, you get the Last Poets, where the hip hop forerunners, this kind of mixture of poetry and blues and jazz, kind of a speaking poetry, a rhythmical poetry. This is Gil Scott-Heron, who died fairly recently. The revolution will not be televised. Again, this mutation between being a poet and being a musician. Oops. Jude Pryor. I'm not addicted to cocaine. I just like the way it smells. The Sugar Hill Gang were the first rap rappers. I said hip hop, hippie to the hippie, hip. I can't do it. You don't stop it. I'll sort of try and play it. You have to be fast. I'm not fast enough. Public Enemy. So in the mainstream of American literature, you get slowly this hip persona being embodied by people like Don DeLillo. The writer is a person who stands outside society, independent of his affiliation, independent of its influence. Again, another sense of being an outsider, a kind of a modernism which isn't establishment. This is a coup in Chile, which is inaugurated by called the Chicago Boys, who introduced the notion of monetarism as part of the coup to eliminate socialism. It was called the Chicago Shock Treatment and was part of the process of introducing economic liberalism to the global economy. A case of the CIA introducing Chicago blues to Chile. The sort of a twisted notion of what might be called Chicago blues. So New York in the late 70s and early 80s, a mixture of punk, rock, hip hop, graffiti art, zines, independent recording, guerrilla media, DIY aesthetics. New York's pretty much cleaned out of that counterculture. All the clubs have closed down and streets have been cleaned up. Patti Smith, Bob Dylan, Patti Smith. So there's kind of a network of, a kind of memory network of, which comes out of the 50s and is to do with these hybrid forms of music and jazz and performance and politics. This is Arthur Rimbaud. I turned silences and nights into words. I was unutterable. I wrote down. I made the world stand still. This is writer Kathy Acker. Kind of mix being a sexual outlaw with a beat poet and a cool hipster in the process of forging a new image of the in-between spaces of each. So she drew up, again, a hybrid form of writing, kind of reference to European avant-garde writing like Alan Rob Gray, but also genres of detective novels and soft porn and even plagiarism of novels. So a kind of hybrid form of writing. Went against this idea of avant-garde pure writing. It was a kind of new attitude, a new attitude to image. You get these figures like Kathy Acker in the 80s and Basquiat, Jean-Michel Basquiat. Here's Bird on Money. So this kind of history quoted with the history of deviancy and street and jazz and outsider boxers and musicians, Charlie Parker. Basquiat became the symbol of hip in all his gestures, and in turn his art was like a memorial to its very syntax, as art and life joined in the reflex of hip, which both the knowledge of history but also its living theatre. So this sort of emblemized hip becoming part of the mainstream of the art economy. His painting sold for over $100 million after his death. It was part of the ascendancy of hipster culture into the mainstream. This is Debbie Harry. Again, mixed uptown music with downtown Bronx, and so he's first to commercialize hip hop in the mainstream. Iggy Pop. Kim Gordon and Sonic Youth. Kurt Cobain. This is William Gibson, who developed an idea of cyberpunk. In the sense that this culture is incorporated into the mainstream. You know it's gone to hell when the best rapper out there is a white guy and the best golfer is a black guy. Let's finish there. Any questions, any thoughts? It's a very rapid constellation of figures and thoughts, but go on.
I was wondering, Jonathan, if you could say a little bit more about, thank you, by the way, I love all of the people that you were talking about and just the history and just the way you summarized everything. It was just awesome. But yeah, the living theatre part, could you just like expand on that?
Living theatre. Well, there was a group called Living Theatre.
Oh, you were talking about. Okay.
But there's also a kind of sense of the street being taken over for gestures of the street, becoming a kind of theatre, a kind of performance constantly, and kind of figures who were kind of half in the media and half on the street. So kind of a sort of meeting point between politics and hipster and poetry, a kind of lilt, a kind of lyric. So one moment it's protest, the next moment it's art, and it's fluid. It's kind of on the move all the time. Doesn't wait for the right context or the purified context. And it's transgression. It's moving against something. It's resistant. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? I can play. I've got about 10 or 12. I can share the screen again. I'll share this map. I'm not eliminating the final screen. Share screen. Sorry, I'm doing wrong. That's it. Click to exit. All right, so getting there. A file made up. Share the screen.